The Morning the Church Bells Never Rang, a Miss Marple Mystery, Millbrook Fen, Kent, 1952. Chapter 1. Silence Where the Bells Should Be. The first thing anyone noticed wrong with that Sunday was not a scream, nor a shout, nor even a hurried footstep on the gravel path. It was an absence. At 8:05, when the bells of St. Aldhelm's ought to have begun their steady call across the water meadows, there was nothing. Only the ordinary sounds of a village morning, a cartwheel creaking somewhere near the green, a dog barking twice and giving it up, the distant complaint of gulls following the river up from the estuary. Mrs. Prudence Hallett, who had lived across from the churchyard for 11 years and set her kettle by the 8 o'clock peal, as reliably as she set it by the wireless pips, stood at her scullery window with the kettle forgotten in her hand. "That's odd," she said, to no one, since her husband had already gone down to see about the milk. "That's very odd indeed." She was not alone in noticing. Along the high street, in the bakery and the post office and the small damp room behind the Fen Arms where old Mr. Tapscott took his morning ale before anyone else in the village had finished their tea, people paused, frowned, and glanced toward the square grey tower that stood above the yew trees like a patient sentinel. Thomas Aldridge had rung those bells every Sunday for the better part of 6 years, ever since he'd come back from his national service with a bad knee and a good deal of restless energy that needed somewhere respectable to go. He was never late. He was, if anything, painfully early, arriving a full half-hour before the first stroke was due, so that he might polish the brass fittings and check the ropes, a small vanity he never quite admitted to. It was the verger, a narrow, anxious man named Wilfred Coggins, who went up to see what had delayed him, muttering under his breath about young men and their late nights. And it was Wilfred Coggins who came back down the tower stairs a good deal faster than he had gone up them, white as the whitewash on the vestry wall, unable at first to make any words come out at all. By the time Dr. Simon Latch arrived, summoned by a boy sent running without hat or jacket, half the village green had already gathered at a respectful distance from the church door, drawn by that peculiar instinct that tells a small community when something has gone badly wrong, long before anyone troubles to explain what. Thomas Aldridge lay at the foot of the bell tower stairs, his neck at an angle that no sleeping man's neck ever assumed, one hand still looped through the frayed end of the tenor bell rope, as though he had reached for it on the way down and missed. "A fall," said Constable Peter Renner, arriving out of breath and rather too eager to have an opinion. "Poor devil, those stairs are a disgrace. I've said as much to the parish council myself, more than once." Dr. Latch, kneeling by the body with the particular stillness of a man who has seen death often enough not to flinch from it, but not so often that it fails to move him, said nothing at all for a long moment. Then he glanced up toward the dim spiral of stone steps rising into shadow, and down again at the young man's throat, where the collar had been pulled awry, and he frowned in the manner of a man doing careful arithmetic that will not quite come out even. Among the small crowd gathering at the Lich Gate, standing rather to one side with the mild, unremarkable air of an elderly woman who has come to church early and found herself delayed, was Miss Jane Marple. She was visiting her niece, Mrs. Delphine Ashworth Price, for a fortnight's holiday in what the brochures like to call the unspoilt corner of Kent, and she had been looking forward to nothing more strenuous than the flower show and a great deal of quiet needlework. She did not push forward. She did not ask questions. She stood with her gloved hands folded before her blue eyes moving without apparent urgency over the faces of the crowd, over Wilfred Coggins, still trembling, over the vicar, the Reverend Aldous Whitfield, hurrying from the vicarage with his surplice half-buttoned and an expression of genuine, unguarded shock that seemed, to Miss Marple's practised eye, to contain something else beneath it, something closer to dread than grief. Over a young woman in a green cardigan, standing quite alone at the edge of the churchyard wall, twisting a handkerchief in both hands, and not weeping, though her face had the fixed, terrible calm of someone who dared not begin. "How very sad," said Miss Marple to her niece, who had come rushing up in her dressing gown with her hair still in curlers. "Such a nice-looking young man. He rang the bells so beautifully. I noticed him particularly, at evensong on Thursday. Practicing, I imagine. He seemed so very careful about it. It does seem strange that a man so careful about his ropes and his footing should simply fall." "Aunt Jane," said Delphine a little breathlessly, "you can't possibly think—" "I think nothing at all, my dear," said Miss Marple placidly, though her eyes had not stopped moving. "I am persuaded the constable is quite right, and it was a dreadful accident. It is only that I have found, over a great many years, that the things which seem strange very often are." Chapter 2. Tea Leaves and Trembling Hands. By 11 o'clock, the news had travelled the length and breadth of Millbrook Fen, with the peculiar speed that bad news always seems to command in small places, arriving in every kitchen and shop and hedgeside conversation, dressed in a slightly different set of clothes each time it appeared. In the Copper Kettle tea room on the High Street, where Delphine had taken her aunt for what she promised would be a restorative pot of Darjeeling and a scone, the talk was of little else. "An accident, they're saying," announced Mrs. Ottoline Fanshawe, the vicar's housekeeper, settling herself at the next table with the confident air of a woman who considered herself close to all sources of authority. "Though I don't mind telling you, Mrs. Ashworth Price, I never trusted those tower stairs. Steep as anything, and no proper rail till you're halfway up." "He'd been up and down them 100 times, though, hadn't he?" said the woman behind the counter, a broad, capable person named Sadie Blount, who ran the tea room with her sister and missed very little that passed along the street outside her window. "You'd think a man would know his own stairs by now." "Perhaps he was in a hurry," offered Delphine. "Perhaps," said Mrs. Fanshawe, in the tone of someone who did not believe it for a moment. "Though I'll say this and no more. The Reverend's had a face on him like a wet Monday these 3 weeks past, and I did wonder." Miss Marple, buttering her scone with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman entirely at leisure, said nothing, but she listened with the whole of her attention, in the way she had once listened to the small dramas of St. Mary Mead, the borrowed sixpence never repaid, the glance held a fraction too long across a shop counter, the small, telling inconsistency in an account of where one had been on a Tuesday afternoon. Village talk, she had found, was rarely wrong about the facts, and very often wrong about their meaning, and the two things were worth keeping carefully separate. "Had he any family?" she asked, in the mild voice of a stranger making polite conversation. "The young man who died, I mean. It seems so very sad, to go so suddenly, with no one to mourn him properly." "An aunt out Faversham way, I believe," said Sadie Blount. "But he was courting our Ivy Nettleton. That's her you'll have seen at the churchyard, the poor lamb, in the green cardigan. They were to be married at Michaelmas. She works up at the manor, for old Mrs. Torrance." "How dreadful for her," murmured Miss Marple, and filed the name away with the small, precise care of a woman arranging pins in a cushion, each one to be found again exactly where she had left it. "He was doing well for himself, mind," Mrs. Fanshawe went on, warming to her theme. "New wireless set, new bicycle only last month. Wilfred Coggins was saying only yesterday he didn't know how a bell ringer and part-time clerk came by such things, not on what the parish pays." "People do sometimes have private means," said Delphine. "People sometimes have private arrangements," said Mrs. Fanshawe darkly, and would say no more on the subject, though it was evident she considered she had said a great deal. A young farmhand at the next table, waiting for his mother to finish her shopping, ventured that he'd heard tell of a tramp seen along the towpath the previous week, a stranger with no business in the village, and that surely a stranger was a good deal more likely to have done murder than any of their own respectable neighbours. This theory was received with the polite but unconvinced silence such theories generally receive in villages where everyone privately understands that the most dangerous secrets are never the ones brought in from outside, but the ones that have been quietly maturing, unnoticed, in familiar faces for years. Sadie Blount's sister, a thin, nervous woman named Doris who rarely spoke above a murmur, offered timidly that perhaps it truly had been an accident after all, and wasn't it unkind of everyone to go hunting for murderers among perfectly ordinary people merely because a tragedy had occurred, and was roundly ignored by the table at large, which had already, collectively and without any formal agreement, decided that ordinary people were precisely where the answer would be found, given time enough to look properly. Miss Marple listened to all of this with the placid, faintly abstracted air of an elderly visitor more interested in her scone than in village scandal, though in truth she was cataloguing, with the same careful attention she gave to unfamiliar stitches in a piece of needlework, each small contradiction and each small certainty offered around her, noting, for instance, that Mrs. Fanshaw's dark hints about the vicar had been offered with a certain relish that suggested more personal grievance than genuine suspicion, whereas Sadie Blount's remarks about the new wireless and bicycle had been offered plainly, as simple observed fact, and were, Miss Marple privately judged, considerably more likely to matter in the end than anyone's opinion of the vicar's recent temper. That afternoon, walking back from the tea room along the lane that ran beside the churchyard wall, Miss Marple paused, as an elderly lady might reasonably pause to admire a well-kept hedge, and looked for some time at the tower of St. Aldhelm's rising grey and silent against the sky. A single window, high up, stood open, the belfry window, she supposed, left so for ventilation, or perhaps because someone had opened it and not yet thought to close it again. Such a very great deal of trouble people take, she said to herself, in the small, comfortable murmur she reserved for her own private observations, to explain away the things that puzzle them, rather than sit quietly and let the puzzle explain itself. Chapter 3. The Vicar's Unsteady Smile. The Reverend Aldous Whitfield had come to Millbrook Fen 9 years before, a bachelor of 40, with a scholarly stoop, and a genuine, if sometimes absent-minded, fondness for his parishioners. He was, by common consent, a good vicar, not a brilliant preacher, but a kind one, the sort of man who remembered the names of children's dolls and never forgot a sick-bed. It was this reputation, more than anything, that made the change in him over the past month so noticeable to those who troubled to notice such things. Miss Marple, calling at the vicarage that afternoon on the entirely legitimate errand of returning a book of pressed flowers that Delphine had borrowed from the vicar's late mother's collection, found him in his study, with the curtains half drawn against a bright afternoon, a cold cup of tea untouched at his elbow. "Miss Marple," he said, rising with the automatic courtesy of a man well trained in receiving parishioners, though his eyes had the unfocused look of someone whose thoughts were a good many miles from his drawing-room. "Forgive me. This has been a most distressing morning." "Of course it has," said Miss Marple, settling herself in the chair he indicated with the comfortable, unhurried manner of a woman who intends to stay exactly as long as she pleases. "Such a shock for the whole village. And for you most particularly, I imagine, Vicar. You must have known young Mr. Aldridge very well indeed, working so closely together." "He was reliable," said the vicar, and there was something in the small pause before the word that caught Miss Marple's attention as surely as a dropped stitch catches the eye in an otherwise even piece of knitting. "A conscientious young man. The parish will feel his loss. Had he seemed troubled to you at all in recent weeks? Sometimes young men carry burdens they don't care to share, even with those closest to them." The Reverend Whitfield's hand, reaching for his cold tea, was not quite steady. "I couldn't say. I did not know him so very well, in truth. Our dealings were chiefly practical. The bells, the church accounts on occasion, since he had a good head for figures and helped Wilfrid with the parish books." "How useful," said Miss Marple. "It is such a comfort to have someone reliable with figures. My own dear father used to say that a man's character showed nowhere so plainly as in his handling of small sums of money, whether he was scrupulous over a shilling as well as a pound. She could not have said, had anyone asked her, precisely why she chose to say this, except that she had spent the whole of a long life watching how people's faces changed when a chance remark landed nearer the mark than they expected, and the Reverend Whitfield's face changed now, very slightly, in a manner she thought worth remembering. A tightening about the eyes, quickly smoothed away, the practised composure of a man returning hastily to his pulpit manner. "Quite so," he said. "If you'll forgive me, Miss Marple, I have a great deal to attend to. The bishop must be informed, and poor Wilfrid is in no state to manage the parish register today." She left him with every appearance of having accomplished nothing more than an errand of returning a book, and walked back through the vicarage garden past beds of late roses gone slightly to seed, thinking not of what the vicar had said, but of what he had so carefully not said, and of the particular quality of fear, for she was now quite certain it was fear, and not merely grief, that had sat upon his shoulders like a second, heavier surplice. At the garden gate she encountered Wilfrid Coggins, on his way to the vicarage with an armful of ledgers, his narrow face still drawn and grey from the morning's discovery. "Dreadful business, Miss Marple," he said, pausing to mop his brow, though the afternoon was mild. "I shan't sleep tonight, I'm sure of it. Finding him there, at the bottom of the stairs, so still." "It must have been a very great shock," said Miss Marple gently. "Tell me, Mr. Coggins, was it usual for the belfry window to stand open? I noticed it, walking past the churchyard." Wilfrid blinked, as though the question surprised him out of his own distress. "Now that you mention it, no. No, that's queer. I'm most particular about that window, on account of the pigeons. I always close it myself, last thing of a Saturday." He frowned, working at some private puzzle. "I don't recall opening it yesterday at all." "How very interesting," said Miss Marple, and smiled at him with such gentle grandmotherly reassurance that he went on his way a little comforted, without ever quite registering that he had told her something he had not meant to tell anyone. Chapter 4. A ledger full of whispers. Constable Renner's satisfaction with his theory of accidental death lasted rather less than a full day. Dr. Latch's report, delivered to the small police house that evening with the terse discomfort of a man obliged to complicate a simple matter, noted a bruise about the throat, consistent with pressure applied by a hand, and a quantity of grit and grazing to the palms that suggested Thomas Aldridge had been very much alive and struggling before whatever had happened to him on those stairs had happened. "Not an accident, then," said Renner, staring at the report as though it had personally inconvenienced him, which in a sense it had. "I shouldn't like to swear to anything in a court of law," said Dr. Latch carefully, "but I would not care to sign a certificate saying he simply fell. Someone had hold of him, constable, before he went down those stairs. Whether by design or in some manner of scuffle, I cannot tell you. That is for cleverer men than me." By the following morning, a detective inspector had been sent down from the county town, a brisk, sandy-haired man named Harmon, who had the brusque competence of someone who had solved a good many straightforward cases and had not yet learned to be humble about the ones that weren't. He established himself in the small back room of the Fen Arms, requisitioned the parish ledgers that Thomas Aldridge had helped to keep, and began, with commendable thoroughness, to interview everyone who had so much as nodded to the dead man in the past 6 months. It was in going through those ledgers 2 days later that Inspector Harmon found the first thread worth pulling. "Odd sort of thing," he said to Renner, spreading the pages across the table of the makeshift interview room. "The church accounts are neat as you like. Young Aldridge had a fine hand and kept them scrupulously, by all accounts. But there's a separate book here, tucked in behind the parish register, that isn't church business at all. Sums of money. Small amounts, regular as clockwork, going back the better part of a year. £5 here, 3 there, once as much as 20. No names, only initials." Renner peered over his shoulder. Blackmail, sir. I don't like to jump to conclusions, said Harmon, in the manner of a man about to do exactly that. But a young bell ringer and church clerk with a new bicycle, a new wireless, and a private ledger of unexplained payments does rather suggest it, wouldn't you say? The question is, who was paying him and what for? The initials, when set out plainly, made for uncomfortable reading. AW, a set of payments stretching back 11 months, the largest of them only a fortnight before the murder. HP, smaller, more frequent sums. RA, a single substantial payment made some 3 months prior, and nothing since, as though whatever debt it represented had been settled once and for all. And, more troublingly still, a fourth set of initials that appeared only twice, faintly, as though the writer had hesitated even to record them at all. MCAW, said Harmon thoughtfully. That would be your vicar, unless I'm much mistaken. Aldous Whitfield. Surely not the vicar, sir, said Renner, genuinely shocked. He's not the sort. There is no sort, Constable, when it comes to secrets, said Harmon, with the air of a man delivering a maxim he was rather pleased with. Everyone has something they'd pay to keep quiet. The trick is finding out what, and whether it was worth killing over. That same afternoon, word of the ledger, for such things could never be kept wholly private in a village the size of Millbrook Fen, however much Inspector Harmon might wish it, reached the Copper Kettle tea room within the hour, carried by the police house's own charwoman, who happened also to be second cousin to Sadie Blount. Blackmail, breathed Mrs. Fanshawe, quite pale. In our own parish. I said there was something not right about that young man's finances, didn't I say so? Miss Marple, who had called in for a small pot of tea, and found herself, as usual, at the very centre of the village's information network, without ever having sought it, listened with interest and said very little, though she thought privately that a young man, clever enough to keep a secret ledger of blackmail payments, hidden behind an innocent parish register, was a good deal cleverer than the village had given him credit for, and that such cleverness, in her long experience, very rarely went entirely unpunished. Chapter 5. The Woman Who Remembered Wrong. Margaret Colfax kept the choir of St. Aldhelm's with a firm hand and a fine soprano voice that had, in her youth, she was fond of saying, nearly taken her to a concert platform in London before the war intervened, as wars have a habit of intervening in the small ambitions of ordinary people. She had come to Millbrook Fen some 7 years before, a quiet, capable widow of perhaps 50, and had made herself indispensable to the parish with a speed and thoroughness that some of the older residents privately thought remarkable, though none of them could have said precisely why it troubled them. Miss Marple met her properly for the first time at a meeting of the Flower Show Committee held at the Manor House 3 days after the murder, ostensibly to discuss the arrangement of trestle tables, and rather more urgently, in every conversation that took place in its margins, to discuss the death of Thomas Aldridge. Such a tragedy, said Mrs. Colfax, pouring tea with hands that were perfectly steady, though Miss Marple noted the particular care with which she set down the pot, as a woman does who has trained herself, over long practice, never to let her hands betray her. He had a lovely voice, you know, for a young man who never had a lesson in his life. I had hopes of bringing him into the choir properly, in time. You must have known him quite well then, said Miss Marple, through the music. Not well, said Mrs. Colfax, a shade too quickly. One doesn't, really. With the younger people nowadays, they keep their own counsel. How true that is, Miss Marple agreed placidly. Though I find, in my own experience, that the young keep counsel chiefly about the things that matter most to them, and are perfectly frank about everything else. It is only a question of knowing where to listen. She smiled, and helped herself to a small sandwich, and asked, in the same mild tone, "Were you acquainted with Mr. Aldridge's family at all? I understand he had an aunt out toward Faversham." Something passed very swiftly across Mrs. Colfax's face, gone almost before it arrived, But Miss Marple, whose eyes had spent 80 years cataloguing precisely such fleeting things, caught it nonetheless. "I never met her," said Mrs. Colfax. "Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," said Miss Marple. "Only that families are such curious things, are they not? The connections one finds, sometimes in the most unexpected quarters. I was remarking to my niece only yesterday how very small a place England has become since the war, for all its size. One is forever discovering that one's acquaintance in Kent knew one's acquaintance in Yorkshire, or served in the same town abroad, or attended the same wedding 30 years before, quite without either party recalling the other, until some chance word brings it all back." She did not look directly at Mrs. Colfax as she said this, but continued placidly with her sandwich, and it was several seconds before Mrs. Colfax replied, in a voice that had lost, very slightly, its earlier composure, that indeed the war had scattered a great many people into strange corners, and she herself had lost touch with nearly everyone she had known before it. "I find," said Miss Marple later to Delphine as they walked home from the manor through the lengthening afternoon light, "that Mrs. Colfax is a most interesting woman." "Interesting how, Aunt Jane?" "She remembers her own history very smoothly indeed," said Miss Marple, "as a woman does who has told it to herself so many times that she has quite worn away the rough edges that make a true memory recognizable. It is the difference, my dear, between a story one has lived and a story one has learned. I could not tell you yet which hers is, but I intend to find out." Chapter 6. Buttons, Boots, and a Borrowed Key. Inspector Harmon, for his part, had settled with some satisfaction upon the theory that the Reverend Aldous Whitfield, driven to some act of desperation by the threat of exposure, had followed Thomas Aldridge into the bell tower on the Saturday evening, and, in the course of an argument that had grown heated beyond either man's intention, had caused his death, whether by design or by the sort of accident that occurs when frightened men lay hands on one another in a confined space. It was, Harmon privately considered, a tidy solution, wanting only a confession to complete it, and he set about obtaining one with the brisk confidence of a man who had rarely been disappointed in such efforts before. The Reverend Whitfield, questioned closely in his own study, admitted with evident wretchedness that he had indeed been paying Thomas Aldridge small sums of money over the better part of a year. "It was nothing so dark as you suppose, Inspector," he said, his hands twisting together in his lap. "I had, that is, some years ago, before I took orders, I found myself in a certain amount of debt, of a kind that would not reflect well upon a clergyman were it generally known. Card debts, Inspector. A foolish young man's foolishness, long since repaid to my actual creditors, but Aldridge came upon a letter, I scarcely know how, perhaps sorting old parish correspondence, for the letter had somehow found its way into a box of my late predecessor's papers, a letter referring to the matter in terms that would have been deeply embarrassing had it come before the bishop, or before my parishioners. He asked for money to keep silent. I paid it. I am not proud of the fact, but I did not kill him for it, Inspector. I had no reason to. The debt was a small one, and shrinking with every month. I had, if you must know, very nearly resolved to tell him I would pay no more, and let the consequences fall where they might, for I had grown heartily tired of being afraid of my own past. "And where were you, Reverend, on Saturday evening between the hours of 8 and 11? "In this room," said the vicar, writing my sermon quite alone, as I generally am of a Saturday evening. I have no one who can confirm it, more's the pity, and I am aware how that must sound. Harmon left the vicarage with his tidy theory considerably less tidy than it had been that morning, and called next upon Harold Pruitt, the shopkeeper whose initials, H.P., had likewise appeared with damning regularity in Aldridge's private ledger. Pruitt, a stout, perspiring man who ran the village's only grocer's shop, was a good deal less composed than the vicar had been, and confessed, after a good deal of blustering denial, that he had for some years been quietly adjusting the weights on his scales to his own modest advantage. A small dishonesty, he insisted, practised by half the grocers in England, and one that Aldridge had somehow detected and threatened to report to the parish council, an exposure that would have ruined Pruitt's trade and his standing alike, in a village where such matters were never forgiven, however small. "I paid him because I had to," said Pruitt miserably, "not because I wished him harm. Where was I Saturday evening? At home with the wife, Inspector, as any night. She'll tell you the same. It was Miss Marple, walking that same afternoon along the lane that led past the churchyard toward the vicarage, who noticed a small, seemingly trivial thing that would occupy a good deal of her thinking over the days that followed. A single brass button, of a kind used on a woman's winter coat rather than any garment a man might wear, caught in the ivy that grew thick along the base of the bell tower wall, directly beneath the belfry window that Wilfred Coggins swore he had not left open. She did not touch it. She noted its position with care, and its distance from the door, and the fact that it lay on the side of the tower nearest the vicarage garden, rather than the churchyard path proper, and she went on her way with the mild, unhurried air of a lady out for her afternoon constitutional, saying nothing to anyone at all. Not yet. Chapter 7. The Shopkeeper's Locked Drawer. It was Delphine who, quite by accident, provided her aunt with the next thread worth following, over breakfast 3 mornings after the murder. "Such a peculiar thing, Aunt Jane," she said, buttering her toast. "I was in Pruitt's yesterday, and I happened to mention poor Mr. Aldridge, and Mrs. Pruitt went quite white and left the shop altogether, on some excuse about the washing. Harold Pruitt looked fit to be sick himself. I thought it very odd, since I understand from Sadie Blount that the police have already been to see him." "Had they indeed?" said Miss Marple with interest. "Tell me, my dear, do you know whether Mr. and Mrs. Pruitt have any children? A daughter, I believe. Married and gone up to London some years back. Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," said Miss Marple, in the tone that Delphine had learned, over a fortnight's acquaintance with her aunt's methods, generally concealed a very particular reason indeed. That afternoon, Miss Marple called at the grocer's shop on the pretext of purchasing a £1/4 of tea, and found Harold Pruitt alone behind the counter, a good deal thinner in the face than he had appeared even a week before. "A dreadful business altogether," she observed, as he weighed her tea with scrupulous, almost desperate care, as though the accuracy of his scales might somehow atone for whatever sins the inspector had already uncovered. "I understand you knew Mr. Aldridge rather better than most, Mr. Pruitt, through the parish accounts." "I knew him to speak to," said Pruitt shortly. "No more than that." "It is such a very great burden," said Miss Marple gently, "to carry a secret one is ashamed of, and to have it discovered by someone with no scruples about the using of it. I have known several such cases in my own village over the years, and it is remarkable how very often the burden itself, rather than the original sin, comes to weigh most heavily on a person. The constant fear of exposure, worse by far than the exposure itself would likely prove, if it ever came. I always think it such a pity when people do not simply tell the truth at the outset, and have done with the fear of it." Pruitt's hands, weighing out the tea, had gone quite still. "Easy to say, for them as have never had a family's good name to think of," he said, low and bitter. "I've a daughter married well, up in London, a solicitor's wife, no less, moving in circles that wouldn't look twice at a common grocer for a father-in-law if they knew the truth of how he came by his savings. I never hurt a soul, Miss Marple, whatever they say. A thumb on the scale, a pinch short on the sugar, small things, done by half the trade, and I'd have told her the whole of it myself, I think, sooner than go on paying that young devil forever. There's a limit to what a man can bear, even over small things, when he's made to bear it in secret and alone. Where were you kept from telling her, Mr. Pruitt? What stopped you at the last?" But Pruitt, seeming to recollect all at once to whom he was speaking, closed his mouth like a trap, and would say no more, wrapping her tea with hands that trembled very slightly, and Miss Marple left the shop with the small, private satisfaction of a woman who has learned a great deal more than she asked for, and considerably more than the person answering her had intended to give away. Chapter 8. What the Choir Loft Kept. The initials R.A. had puzzled Inspector Harmon rather more than the others, since the single substantial payment they represented had been made some 3 months before the murder, and never repeated, as though whatever debt they signified had been settled once and completely. It was Constable Renner, going through the electoral register with more patience than imagination, who first suggested that R.A. might stand for Colonel Reginald Ashby, a retired officer of some 70 years who lived in a small, well-tended cottage at the far end of the village, and was generally regarded as one of Millbrook Fen's more solid and unremarkable citizens. The colonel, when Harmon called upon him, received the suggestion with a composure that seemed, at first, entirely genuine. "Paid the fellow, yes," he said, settling into his armchair with the deliberate calm of a man who has long practice at appearing calmer than he feels. "No sense denying it, since I imagine you've the figures in black and white. Not blackmail in the way you're thinking, Inspector, or rather it was, but the matter it concerned is one I'd rather discuss with you in confidence than have paraded before the whole village, if it's all the same to you. I'm afraid very little is confidential in a murder inquiry, Colonel." Ashby was quiet a moment, his weathered hands folded before him. "There was a man under my command, in Italy, in '44, he said at last. "A court-martial matter, desertion, in the face of the enemy, or so it appeared at the time. I signed the report that sent him before a tribunal. He was shot, Inspector, on my evidence." He paused. It came to light afterward, too late to matter to him, that the case against him had been rather thinner than I'd believed at the time. A misidentification, a confusion of names in the confusion of a very bad night. I have carried that mistake a good many years, and said nothing of it to a living soul, until young Aldridge, of all people, produced a letter, I never learned how he came by it, referring to the affair in terms specific enough to leave no doubt he knew the whole of it. I paid him to keep it from becoming village gossip, Inspector, not from any fear of the law, for there was no crime in what I did, only an error no court could now undo. I paid him once, and told him plainly there would be no second payment, whatever he chose to do with his knowledge. That was 3 months ago. I have not spoken to him since, beyond the ordinary courtesies of village life. "And where were you on the Saturday evening in question, Colonel?" "At my club in Maidstone until the last train," said Ashby steadily, "as I am every 3rd Saturday of the month, and as the club steward will readily confirm." Harmon left the cottage inclined to believe him, if only because a man who had already paid his debt in full, and told his blackmailer plainly there would be no more forthcoming, seemed to Harmon's mind a less promising suspect than one still labouring under an active and growing fear, which left, troublingly, the 4th and faintest set of initials in Aldridge's ledger, MC. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had turned her own attention to the choir loft of St. Aldhelm's, where she had taken to attending Wednesday evening choir practice as an interested visitor, ostensibly charmed by the music, and in truth watching Margaret Colfax conduct her small assembly of village voices with a precision that struck Miss Marple as belonging to someone considerably better trained than a provincial choir mistress had any obvious right to be. "You conduct so professionally, Mrs. Colfax," she observed afterward, over the tea that was always provided following practice. "One would almost think you had trained at the Royal College, or somewhere very like it." "I studied a little in my youth," said Mrs. Colfax, with the smooth, well-worn ease of an answer given many times before. "Nothing so grand as that, I'm afraid." "Before the war, I imagine," said Miss Marple. "So many promising young careers were lost to it. I had a young cousin myself, a gifted violinist, who never returned to the concert platform afterward. The years simply could not be recovered, however much talent remained. Where did you study, might I ask? I have a niece most curious about such things, and always delighted to hear of another's musical education." There was the faintest hesitation, no more than half a breath, before Mrs. Colfax answered, "In the north. A small conservatory long since closed, I believe, in the bombing." And she turned, rather too promptly, to some question of the tenor line in Sunday's anthem, and the subject was allowed to lapse. But Miss Marple, walking home in the blue dusk with the last notes of the choir still faintly audible behind her, found herself dwelling on that half-breath of hesitation with the close attention she gave to very few things in life besides her knitting pattern and the behaviour of her fellow creatures. For she had noticed, over 80 years of quiet observation, that people telling the truth about their own history answer such questions promptly, without needing first to select which version of the truth to offer. Chapter 9. A Letter Never Posted. Ivy Nettleton had said very little to anyone since the morning the bells failed to ring, a silence the village had, on the whole, respected, putting it down to the natural and proper grief of a young woman who had lost the man she was to marry. Miss Marple, however, calling at the manor house on the pretext of admiring old Mrs. Torrance's celebrated rose garden, found an opportunity to speak with the girl alone in the small walled kitchen garden where she had been sent to cut mint for the kitchen. "You must miss him very dreadfully," said Miss Marple gently, without preamble, for she had found over the years that grief, unlike guilt, generally welcomed a direct and sympathetic approach rather than being frightened away by one. Ivy's hands, cutting the mint, went still. "Everyone keeps saying how dreadful it is," she said, in a low, strained voice. "And it is dreadful. Only—" she stopped. "Only it is not quite the simple grief people suppose," Miss Marple finished for her, gently. "Grief is very rarely simple, my dear, when there has been unhappiness mixed in with the love. I have seen a great deal of both in my time, and I promise you there is no shame whatever in feeling them together." Ivy looked up, startled into something like relief at being understood without having first to explain herself. "We'd quarrelled," she said, low. "The Thursday before it happened. He'd been so strange these past months, Miss Marple, secretive. He'd come by money from somewhere he wouldn't account for, and when I asked him outright where it came from, he only laughed and said I'd think better of him for it in time, when we were married and settled, and wasn't that enough for me to know? I told him I didn't want money I couldn't ask questions about. I told him," her voice caught, "I told him I wondered sometimes if I knew him at all. He looked at me so strangely then, almost frightened, though I couldn't think what he had to be frightened of, with me. He said there were things a person did for good reasons that looked bad from the outside, and things a person did for bad reasons that looked good, and that I mustn't judge him till I understood which was which. And then he wouldn't say another word on it. However, I pressed him, and we parted angry, and I never had the chance to make it right before." She could not finish, and turned away, pressing the back of one hand hard against her mouth. "There now," said Miss Marple, with the particular firm gentleness she reserved for genuine distress, laying a hand briefly on the girl's arm. "You are not to blame yourself for a quarrel that ended in nothing worse than words, my dear. Young people quarrel. It is no more than the ordinary weather of a courtship, and he would have known that as well as you." She paused. "Did he say anything more specific, Ivy? Anything at all about what troubled him? Even a small thing may matter a very great deal in circumstances such as these." Ivy was quiet a long moment, wiping her eyes with the back of a mint-stained hand. "There was one thing," she said slowly. "He said, I thought it nonsense at the time, the sort of thing a person says when they want to sound important without saying anything real. He said that some people in this village weren't who they claimed to be at all, and that he'd found it out quite by accident, going through the old parish papers for the vicar, and that it had put him in a position to do a great deal of good, if he was careful, and he meant to use it that way, not for gain. Only I didn't wholly believe him, and I told him so, which was perhaps unkind, but I couldn't see how blackmail, for that is what it plainly was, whatever he called it, could ever be turned to good." "Did he say which people, my dear, or how he had learned it?" "No," said Ivy, "only that it went back to the war, and that it had taken him months of quiet asking about to be sure of it, because he hadn't wanted to accuse anyone wrongly." She looked up, her eyes red but steady now. "He wasn't a bad man, Miss Marple, whatever anyone says of him now. Muddled, perhaps. Too clever for his own good, and too fond of money he hadn't quite earned honestly. But not bad." "I am sure you are right," said Miss Marple, and meant it, for she had come to think, over the course of her inquiries, that Thomas Aldridge had been a young man of genuinely mixed motives, greedy, certainly, and unwise, but not, she suspected, entirely without some confused notion of justice tangled up in his greed, which made his death, in her private estimation, sadder rather than less so. Chapter 10. The Colonel's Old Campaign. It was 2 days later, over a private conversation in Delphine's drawing room, to which Miss Marple had invited Inspector Harmon on the pretext of offering him a cup of tea he had not, in fact, asked for, that she began, in her mild and roundabout fashion, to set out the shape of what she had learned. "You have been very thorough, Inspector," she said, pouring, "in establishing what each of these unfortunate people paid, and why. But I wonder whether you have given quite enough thought to what Mr. Aldridge intended to do with what he knew, rather than merely what he had already done with it." "Meaning what, precisely, Miss Marple?" "Meaning," said Miss Marple, "that a young man clever enough to discover 3 separate secrets in the private history of this village, and I strongly suspect a 4th, Inspector, of rather greater weight than the others, was very possibly not a simple, straightforward blackmailer, content merely to draw a small, steady income from other people's fear. Ivy Nettleton tells me he spoke, shortly before his death, of using what he knew to do good, and of a matter concerning identity, going back to the war, that he had spent some months confirming before he acted upon it at all. That does not sound to me like a young man merely lining his pocket. It sounds like a young man working his way, cautiously and perhaps rather muddle-headedly, toward some larger purpose. And I think, Inspector, that whatever that purpose was, it may very well have cost him his life, in a manner rather different from simple silencing of a simple blackmailer." Harmon frowned. "You're suggesting there's a 4th secret we haven't got to the bottom of?" "I am suggesting," said Miss Marple, "that the initials MC in that ledger deserve considerably more attention than they have so far received, and that Colonel Ashby's account of his own dealings with Mr. Aldridge, while I believe it to be substantially true, may contain the very thread that leads us to it." She told him, then, of a small errand she had taken it upon herself to run 2 days before. A letter written to an old acquaintance of her late husband's, a retired officer with long memory and longer correspondence among veterans of the Italian campaign, asking, in the most general and unremarkable terms, whether he recalled any case of a wrongful court-martial in the unit the colonel had commanded, and whether he recalled, further, the name of the soldier concerned, and whether that soldier had had any family, a wife, say, or a sweetheart, who might have followed the news of the case with particular grief. "I had a reply only this morning," said Miss Marple, drawing a folded letter from her sleeve with the unhurried satisfaction of a woman producing the final piece of a jigsaw she has long known the shape of. The soldier in question was a young corporal named Alan Vane. He was, I am told, engaged to be married at the time of his death, to a young woman then working as a nursing auxiliary in the same theatre of war, a Miss Rosalind Vane's own cousin in point of fact, who had taken the family name informally after being orphaned young and raised as one of the household. Her given name, Inspector, was Margaret. Inspector Harmon set down his teacup rather more abruptly than good manners generally allowed. Margaret Colfax. "I cannot yet prove it," said Miss Marple, "though I believe a search of the appropriate records, a marriage that never took place, a name quietly set aside after the war and replaced with another, a conservatory in the north that closed in the bombing and cannot therefore be asked to confirm or deny a former pupil's attendance, will bear it out. I believe Mrs. Colfax is not, and never was, a widow of that name at all, but a young woman who lost the man she loved to a wrongful accusation, changed her name and her history in the general confusion that followed the war, as a great many displaced and grieving people did, quite understandably, and built herself a new and respectable life in a village where no one thought to question it. And I believe that Thomas Aldridge, going through old parish papers, perhaps papers relating to her original registration in the parish, or correspondence forwarded from elsewhere under her true name by mistake, discovered the discrepancy, and set himself, in his muddled and not entirely honourable way, to establish the truth of it before deciding what use to make of what he'd found. "But if her secret was merely that she'd changed her name after a personal tragedy," said Harmon slowly, "there's no crime in that, Miss Marple. Why should she kill to protect it?" "Ah," said Miss Marple, "that, Inspector, is precisely the question I have not yet finished asking. I do not believe a changed name alone would drive a respectable woman to murder. I believe there is something further, something Mr. Aldridge uncovered that goes beyond a simple change of identity, and I believe we shall find it, if we look carefully enough, in the manner of Corporal Vane's original court-martial, and in the question of who first brought the accusation against him. Chapter 11. The Photograph in the Prayer Book. Inspector Harmon, to his credit, did not waste time doubting a theory once its logic had been laid before him plainly, whatever its source. Within a day he had set a request in motion to the War Office Records Office for the full particulars of the court-martial of Corporal Alan Vane, and had, in the meantime, called again upon Colonel Ashby to press him for anything further he could recall of the case. The colonel this time was rather less composed than before. There was an informer, he admitted, after some pressing, his weathered face grown grey. "I ought to have said so at the outset, Inspector, but the matter has troubled my conscience a great many years, and I own I did not wish to dredge it up again unless I must. The original accusation against Corporal Vane did not come from any officer's own observation. It came from another soldier in the unit, a man who claimed to have seen Vane slip away from his post the night in question. I believed him at the time. I had no cause not to. It was only afterward, when the confusion of names came to light. There was another man, you understand, of similar build, moving in the darkness that night, and it was very possibly he, not Vane, who was seen, that I began to wonder whether the original witness had told the whole truth, or had perhaps some private grudge against Vane that coloured what he claimed to have seen. "Do you recall the witness's name, Colonel?" Ashby was silent a long moment. "Private Aldridge," he said finally, low. "Edward Aldridge. He and Vane had quarrelled bitterly some weeks before, over a girl, as young soldiers will. I never troubled to learn whether the quarrel had any bearing on what he claimed to have seen that night. I ought to have. It has weighed on me a very great deal, since the truth of the misidentification came to light, that I never properly examined my only witness's motives before sending a man to his death on the strength of them." Harmon sat very still. "Edward Aldridge," he repeated. "Any relation, Colonel, to our Thomas Aldridge?" "His father, Inspector," said Ashby quietly. "I had not connected the two names until this very moment, God forgive me. I do not know why I never thought of it before. I suppose one does not expect the sins of the fathers to walk so plainly back into one's own village, a full 8 years later, wearing a young man's face and ringing the church bells every Sunday, as though nothing in the world were owed." The news, when Harmon carried it to Miss Marple that evening, confirmed a suspicion she had privately begun to entertain some days before, though she had not yet been able to fit every piece of it into place. "So Thomas Aldridge," said Harmon slowly, working it through aloud, "going through old parish papers, discovers that Margaret Colfax is in fact Rosalind Vane, the woman who lost her fiancé to a wrongful court-martial, a court-martial his own father's testimony had helped to bring about. That would explain why he took such particular care to establish the truth of it before acting, guilt perhaps on his father's behalf, or some confused notion of setting right an old wrong." "I believe so," said Miss Marple. And I believe further that when he did at last approach her, not, I think, to demand money, for I do not believe money was ever his true object where she was concerned, whatever it may have been with the others, he told her plainly what he knew, meaning perhaps to make some manner of confession or apology on his father's behalf, or perhaps only to satisfy himself that his suspicion was correct. And I believe that in doing so, quite without meaning it, he handed her a motive for murder considerably stronger than any mere fear of a changed name being discovered. How so? Miss Marple set down her needlework, a small frown of genuine sorrow crossing her gentle face. Because, Inspector, a woman who has spent 7 years building a new life under a borrowed name, in a village that trusts her, conducting the church choir, respected and secure, such a woman might well pay to keep that secret quiet, as we have seen others in this village pay. But I do not think mere exposure of a changed name, however embarrassing, would drive a sensible, capable woman to murder. What would drive her to it, I think, is the discovery that the very family responsible for destroying the life she once had, the life she has spent 7 years quietly grieving and rebuilding from its ashes, had now, by the cruelest of coincidences, arrived to threaten the second life she built in its place. I think, Inspector, that when Thomas Aldridge told her what he knew, some old and terrible anger she believed long buried rose up in her with a force she did not expect and could not, in the moment, control. Harmon was quiet a moment. That supposition, Miss Marple, however well it fits. We've no proof she was ever in that tower at all. No, Miss Marple agreed, not yet. But I believe, if we look carefully at where she keeps her things, we may find rather more than supposition. A woman does not entirely discard the tokens of a lost love, however many names she has worn since. I have observed, in a great many years of watching my fellow creatures, that such tokens are very often kept closest precisely when they are most dangerous to keep at all. Chapter 12. A Visit to Canterbury. It was Delphine once again who unwittingly supplied the next useful thread, mentioning over breakfast that Mrs. Colfax had gone up to Canterbury for the day, on what she'd described to the vicar as a matter of business concerning her late husband's small estate, a detail that struck Miss Marple as worth a closer look, since a woman with genuinely nothing to hide rarely troubles to explain her errands to the vicar quite so particularly, in the manner of someone establishing, in advance, an account of her whereabouts. Miss Marple did not follow her. That, she felt, would have been both impractical and rather beneath her methods. But she did call that same afternoon upon Mrs. Fanshawe, the vicar's housekeeper, whose thoroughness in matters of parish gossip extended, she had reason to believe, to a fairly detailed knowledge of the comings and goings of every household in the village, including such small matters as who took in whose post when they were away, and who had lately had workmen in to alter a fireplace or a cupboard. Mrs. Colfax had her chimney seen to only last spring, said Mrs. Fanshawe, when the conversation had been steered, with Miss Marple's customary gentleness, in that general direction. A queer business. That, she'd the man block up the old bread oven beside it entirely. Said it drew badly and let in damp, though my own opinion, for what it's worth, is that a bread oven never drew smoke in its life, being made for baking and not for burning coal. Cost her a pretty penny too, by what I heard, to have good brickwork undone, for no reason a sensible person could see. How very curious, said Miss Marple, with the mild, unhurried interest of a woman remarking upon nothing more significant than the weather, though she filed the detail away with the greatest care, for she had learned, over a long life, that people rarely spend money altering perfectly sound brickwork without some more particular reason than damp. She mentioned the matter to Inspector Harmon that same evening, and it was Harmon, obtaining without much difficulty a warrant on the strength of Miss Marple's careful reconstruction of events and the ledger evidence already in hand, who set 2 constables to examine the blocked bread oven in Margaret Colfax's cottage the following morning, while its owner was still safely occupied in Canterbury. What they found, wrapped carefully in oilcloth and tucked into the cold, disused brick cavity, was a small collection of things that told, between them, a story more complete than any confession. A faded photograph of a young soldier in uniform, smiling for the camera with the particular unguarded happiness of a man who does not yet know what is coming. A bundle of letters tied with ribbon, signed only "Your Alan." A marriage certificate, dated some months after the letters, made out to a Margaret Colfax and a man who had, according to the parish register of a small church in Yorkshire, died of natural causes some 6 years before Margaret Colfax had ever set foot in Millbrook Fen. A marriage, Harmon quickly established, that had in fact been the union of an entirely different woman altogether, whose identity papers Rosalind Vane appeared, at some point after the war, to have quietly assumed, and, most damning of all, a single sheet of ordinary parish notepaper, in handwriting Harmon recognised at once from the church ledgers as Thomas Aldridge's own, on which was written, in a hand that had plainly trembled a little in the writing of it, "I know who you were. I do not think you a wicked woman for it. But I cannot let it lie, not now I know what my own father did to bring it about. We must speak, properly, before Sunday." "There it is then," said Harmon, when Miss Marple had been shown the letter, at her own quiet insistence, in the makeshift interview room at the Fen Arms. Motive, and something very close to proof she knew he meant to confront her before the murder took place. "Yes," said Miss Marple, and there was, for once, no lightness at all in her voice. "I am afraid there it very largely is." Chapter 13. The Second Fall. It was not, however, until the following evening, a soft, uncertain evening with rain threatening from the west, and the church tower standing dark against a sky the colour of an old bruise, that the final proof presented itself, in a manner Miss Marple had rather hoped, for the sake of everyone concerned, to avoid. Margaret Colfax, returning from Canterbury to find her cottage searched and her secret exposed, did not go home. She went instead to the church, perhaps from some confused instinct toward the one place in the village that had, for 7 years, represented to her the whole of her hard-won respectability, or perhaps only because the tower held, in her mind, the last physical trace of the confrontation that had ended so terribly some 10 days before. It was Miss Marple, walking back from the vicarage in the fading light on an errand of her own devising, who saw the belfry window standing open once again, and who, with a calm that cost her rather more than it appeared to, went at once to fetch Inspector Harmon, rather than venturing up the tower stairs herself, for she had reached an age at which she trusted her judgment considerably more than her knees. They found Margaret Colfax at the top of the tower, standing very close to the same window from which, it now seemed certain, Thomas Aldridge's body had first been pushed after the struggle that killed him, her hands gripping the stone sill with a tightness that spoke, unmistakably, of a woman contemplating whether there might yet be one further fall to follow the first. "Mrs. Colfax," said Miss Marple gently, from the top of the stairs, making no move to come closer, "I think you had better come away from there, my dear. Whatever has happened, and whatever must follow from it, it will not be made better by a second tragedy on top of the first." "You know, then," said Margaret Colfax, for Rosalind Vane she undoubtedly was, and would remain in the record of what followed, whatever name she chose to answer to in the years still left to her. Her voice, when it came, was very quiet and very tired, stripped at last of every trace of the smooth, well-rehearsed composure Miss Marple had noted from their first meeting. "I suppose you have known for some days." "I have suspected for some days," said Miss Marple with careful gentleness. "I did not know for certain until this evening. Won't you come away from the window and tell us the whole of it? I think perhaps you have been carrying it alone for a very great deal longer than these past 10 days, and it is a heavy thing to carry alone." For a long moment Margaret Colfax did not move, and Inspector Harmon, standing very still at Miss Marple's shoulder, made no sound at all, understanding, with the quick instinct of a man who had handled more than one desperate moment in his career, that any sudden movement now might end matters a great deal worse than a confession. Then, slowly, Margaret Colfax stepped back from the window and sank down onto the narrow stone bench that ran along the tower wall, and put her face in her hands, and began, in a voice gone hoarse with 10 days of silence, to tell them everything. "I did not go up those stairs meaning to kill him," she said. "I want that understood, whatever else you believe of me. I went to beg him, Miss Marple, as I have never begged anyone in my life, to let the matter rest. I told him I meant no harm to anyone by the life I had built here. I told him his father's mistake was not his own sin to atone for, and that nothing could be served by dragging Alan's name and mine and the whole wretched business back into the light after 7 years of trying to bury it decently. He would not hear me. He said he owed it to some notion of justice he could not properly explain even to himself, that he had spent months confirming what he suspected, quietly, out of some confused idea that discovering the truth of an old wrong and doing nothing with it was itself a kind of cowardice, and that he meant to see the record put right, whatever it cost either of us. And then he said," her voice broke entirely, "he said that a woman who could build so complete a lie could hardly object to having one small piece of truth spoken at last. And something in me, something I had held very carefully in check for 7 years, simply broke apart at those words, and I do not clearly remember what happened next, only that my hands were at his throat, and he was struggling, and we were somehow at the top of the stairs, and then he was not there any longer, and I stood alone in the dark, not believing what I had done, until I made myself go down and see, and found him at the bottom, quite still, and I went home, and I have not slept a single whole night since." "And the window?" asked Harmon quietly. "Left open both nights?" "I do not know why I opened it," said Margaret Colfax, or Rosalind Vane, wearily. "I think I could not bear the closeness of that place a moment longer, with what I had just done. I did not think of it as a clue. I did not think of anything at all by then, beyond getting myself home before anyone saw me." She was quiet a long while, her hands loose in her lap now, all the earlier tension gone out of them, as though the telling itself had drained some final reserve of strength she had been holding in trust for exactly this moment. "I have asked myself every night since," she went on, "whether I might have found some other way. Whether, if I had only let him speak his piece and gone away and wept in private, as I had wept so many times before over Alan's memory, I might have found some way to bear it without what happened. I do not know. I think perhaps I had simply run out of the particular strength it takes to keep smiling at a village that trusts you, and singing in a choir loft that does not know your true name, and hearing, from the son of the very man who destroyed everything you once loved, that your whole careful, respectable life was built on a lie he intended to expose. I think perhaps I had known, in some buried corner of myself, that this reckoning was always coming, however far I ran, and something in me broke rather than bent when it finally arrived. "Did you mean, at any point, to take your own life as well as his?" asked Miss Marple gently. "I ask only because I think it matters, for what comes after, that the truth of that moment be known as clearly as everything else." "I do not know that either," said Rosalind Vane, very low. "I have thought of it since. I thought of it tonight, standing at that window. But I find I do not have the courage for it, any more than I had the courage, 7 years ago, to simply tell the truth of who I was, and let the world make of it what it would. I have spent my whole life, Miss Marple, finding it easier to become someone else than to face what I actually was. I do not know that I have the strength left to change that now, at the very end of everything." "You have, I think, a great deal more strength than you credit yourself with," said Miss Marple, "if only because you have just told the whole of this terrible truth to 2 people with every power to use it against you, when a more cowardly nature might have gone on lying to the very last." That is not nothing, my dear, whatever else must now follow from it. Chapter 14. Miss Marple pours the tea. The arrest itself was a quiet, almost gentle affair, conducted with a decency on Inspector Harmon's part that surprised those villagers who had expected, given the scale of the scandal, something a good deal more dramatic. Margaret Colfax, for she would be known by that name in the newspapers, whatever the truth beneath it, was taken down from the tower without handcuffs, walking between two constables with the exhausted, almost peaceful composure of a woman who has at last set down a burden she has carried a very long way, and did not resist, or protest, or ask for any mercy beyond a request that someone see to the small tabby cat she kept, which had no one else in the world to look after it. The village, in the days that followed, talked of little else, as villages do, turning the story over and over among themselves at the Copper Kettle and the Fen Arms and the queue outside the post office, each retelling adding some fresh embellishment that had not, strictly speaking, occurred at all. Miss Marple, for her part, took very little part in these retellings, preferring the quiet of Delphine's back garden and the steady, undemanding rhythm of her knitting to the business of being congratulated, which she found, on the whole, rather more tiring than the inquiry itself had been. It was Delphine who brought her the newspaper, 3 days after the arrest, folded open to a small paragraph reporting that Mrs. Margaret Colfax, true name established as Rosalind Vane, had made a full statement to police and would be tried at the next assizes for the murder of Thomas Aldridge. "Do you think they'll be lenient with her, Aunt Jane?" asked Delphine, settling herself on the garden bench beside her aunt with the particular gravity of a young woman confronting, for the first time in her sheltered life, the genuine weight of another person's tragedy. "It does seem, from everything you've told me, that she was very nearly as much a victim as he was." "I could not say what a jury will decide," said Miss Marple, her needles clicking on steadily, for she had found, over a very long life, that the small, repetitive motions of knitting were an excellent aid to clear and honest thought. "It is not for me to judge such things, my dear, only to see that the truth is properly established, so that whatever judgment follows is at least made upon an honest footing. I will say this, however, I have met a great many murderers in my time, of every possible temperament, and very few of them, I think, set out that morning, or that evening, genuinely intending to kill. Most of them are ordinary people, pushed by some old wound or some sudden fear past the point where they can any longer govern themselves, and I find I cannot hate them, quite, even when I am obliged to see that they answer for what they have done. It is the tragedy of it that troubles me most, not merely that a young man died, though that is tragedy enough, but that an old and terrible wrong, done carelessly by one generation, should reach out across 8 years and claim a second life in the doing of it, and very nearly a third, had I not reached that tower a few minutes sooner than I did. Was it Colonel Ashby's fault, then, in the end, for believing the wrong witness? No, said Miss Marple with some firmness. I do not think it useful, or quite fair, to lay the blame at any single door. The Colonel made an honest mistake, in circumstances that gave a great many honest men cause to make similar mistakes, and he has plainly suffered for it a very great deal these 8 years since. But Edward Aldridge, whatever his private grudge, gave testimony he may genuinely have believed true, however much his own quarrel with Corporal Vane may have coloured what he thought he saw in the darkness of that night. And poor Thomas Aldridge, discovering his father's part in the affair, was moved by something that was very nearly a decent instinct, a wish to see an old wrong acknowledged, however clumsily and however dangerously he went about acting upon it. It is the peculiar tragedy of small mistakes, my dear, that they very rarely stay small. They travel down through the years, gathering weight as they go, until they arrive, quite without warning, in the hands of people who had no part whatever in creating them, and are made to bear a burden they never earned. Chapter 15. The Name She Buried. It was some days later, when the worst of the village's excitement had begun at last to settle into the ordinary rhythms of gossip rather than genuine shock, that Miss Marple went once more to visit the Reverend Aldous Whitfield, this time on no pretext at all beyond her own wish to see how he fared. She found him considerably recovered in spirit, though still subdued, sitting in his study with the curtains drawn back for the first time since the murder, the afternoon light falling across a desk now cleared of the anxious clutter she had noticed on her first visit. "I owe you a debt, Miss Marple," he said, rising to greet her, "though I hardly know how to express it properly. Inspector Harmon tells me it was very largely your own observation that brought the truth to light. I confess I had begun to fear, these past weeks, that my own foolish secret would be made to bear the whole weight of suspicion, whatever the truth of the matter." "You had a foolish secret, Vicar," said Miss Marple, settling herself in the chair he offered, "but not, I think, a wicked one. And there is a very great difference between the two, however similar they may appear from the outside, to a frightened man convinced the worst is about to be discovered. I hope you have found it possible, since all this came out, to set down the burden of it at last." "I have written to the bishop myself," said the vicar, with a faint, rueful smile that suggested some of his old good humour was slowly finding its way back to the surface. "Told him the whole of it in plain terms, rather than waiting to have it dragged out of me by an inspector's questioning, or worse, by village gossip. He was, I confess, a good deal kinder about it than I had any right to expect." "There is something remarkably freeing, Miss Marple, in choosing to tell the truth oneself, rather than living forever in dread of it being told by someone else, on worse terms than one's own." "That," said Miss Marple, "is very nearly the whole lesson of this sad business, Vicar. If I may be permitted to draw one, every person caught up in Mr. Aldridge's private ledger was, in their own way, imprisoned by a secret they believed could never survive daylight. And in every case but one, I think, the daylight, when it came, proved a good deal less terrible than the years of dreading it. Colonel Ashby has told his story, and found the village, on the whole, sympathetic rather than condemning, for an old man's honest error made in wartime confusion. Mr. Pruitt's small dishonesties at the scales have cost him some embarrassment, and a fine, I imagine, but not the ruin he feared, and I am told his daughter in London has written to say the matter changes nothing whatever in her regard for him. You yourself have found the bishop kinder than you dared hope. It is only poor Mrs. Colfax, Rosalind Vane, as I must now think of her, whose secret, once uncovered, proved to conceal a genuine crime beneath it rather than merely an old embarrassment, and it is a very great sadness to me that the one person among them with, in some sense, the most sympathetic history behind her secret should be the one whose fear, when finally tested, drove her to the one act that could not be forgiven or set right by any confession, however honest. "Do you think she is truly wicked, then, Miss Marple? I have turned the question over a great many times these past days, and I confess I cannot settle it in my own mind." Miss Marple was quiet a moment, her hands folded in her lap. "I think," she said at last, "that wickedness is a good deal rarer than most people suppose, Vicar, and that what passes for it, in the great majority of cases I have encountered, is very often only an ordinary human weakness, tested by circumstances cruel enough to break it. Mrs. Colfax loved a man cruelly, and wrongly taken from her by a mistake not her own to answer for, and she built, over 7 hard years, a new life out of the wreckage of the old one, brick by careful brick, as a person of real courage and real capability does. And then, through no fault of her own, the very family responsible for that first cruelty arrived at her door once more, in the person of a young man she could not, in fairness, hold guilty of his father's sin, and something in her that had been strained taut for 7 years finally gave way beneath a weight it was never meant to bear alone. I do not excuse what she did, Vicar. A young man is dead who need not have died, and that fact cannot be set aside by any amount of sympathy for the woman who killed him. But I find I cannot look upon her simply as a monster either. I think her, rather, a very unhappy woman who did a terrible thing, and who will now be made to answer for it before the law, as she must. And I think, too, that there is a lesson in it for the rest of us, that old wrongs left unspoken and unatoned rarely stay buried as neatly as we should like, and have a most unfortunate habit of resurfacing, years later, in the lives of people who had no part whatever in creating them. Chapter 16. The Weight of an Old Uniform. The weeks that followed brought a slow, uneven return to ordinary life in Millbrook Fen, though nothing, as Mrs. Fanshawe observed to anyone who would listen, was ever quite so ordinary again as it had been before that silent Sunday morning. The bells of St. Aldhelm's rang once more, tended now by a steady, unremarkable man named Digby, who had rung bells in 3 parishes before this one, and took, everyone agreed, considerably less pride in the polishing of the brass than his predecessor had, but a great deal more comfort in the plain, unhaunted routine of the work. Colonel Ashby, whose part in the old tragedy had become common knowledge through the course of the trial's preliminary proceedings, found himself, in the weeks that followed, an object of a curiosity he bore with a dignity that earned him, in time, rather more sympathy than censure. He took to walking each morning as far as the churchyard wall, and standing there some minutes in silent reflection, a habit the village noted, and, on the whole, respected without remark, understanding, in the wordless way that small communities sometimes manage to understand what individual words would only make clumsy, that an old man was making his own private peace with an old and grievous error. It was Miss Marple who found him there one grey morning, some 3 weeks after the arrest, and who paused to speak with him, not from any wish to press further upon a wound already sufficiently opened, but because she had found, over a long life, that silence offered at the right moment is very often kinder than any words a person might otherwise feel obliged to produce. "I keep thinking," said the Colonel, without preamble, as though continuing a conversation already long underway in his own mind, "that if I had only questioned Private Aldridge's account a little more closely, at the time, asked a single further question, pressed him on the darkness of that night, on the distance, on what precisely he could and could not have seen, none of this need ever have happened at all. A young man would be alive, a woman would not stand accused of manslaughter, and I should be spared the particular misery of knowing that my own carelessness, 30 years past its prime as a soldier, has somehow reached forward across 8 years to claim 2 more lives in payment for the first. You could not have known, Colonel, what your carelessness, if carelessness it truly was, and not simply an honest error made under the impossible pressures of wartime command, would come to cost so many years afterward," said Miss Marple gently. "None of us can see so far ahead as that, however carefully we examine our own conduct in the moment. I think you did what any conscientious officer might have done, faced with a witness who gave his account with apparent conviction, in circumstances that allowed no leisure for the sort of careful cross-examination a barrister might conduct at his ease in a quiet courtroom. It is easy, looking back from a place of safety, to see precisely where a different question might have changed everything. It is a great deal harder, in the moment itself, amid the noise and confusion of a campaign, to know which of 100 ordinary decisions will prove, only many years later, to have been the hinge upon which some terrible chain of consequence was quietly waiting to turn. You are kinder to me than I deserve, Miss Marple." "I am only honest with you, Colonel," said Miss Marple, "which is not always the same thing as kindness, though I hope it may serve nearly as well in this instance. I will say this, however, since you have raised the matter yourself. I think there is more use to be found in what you do with the remainder of your life than in what you continue to reproach yourself for in the years already spent. Corporal Vane cannot be given back his life, nor Miss Vane the happiness that was taken from her, nor Thomas Aldridge the years he might still have lived had matters fallen out differently. But an old wrong, properly acknowledged rather than left to fester in silence, does at least some good in the world, even when it comes very late, and even when the good it does cannot undo the harm that went before it. I think, if you will forgive an old woman's plain speaking, that you have already begun that work, simply in telling the truth of it as plainly and completely as you have, rather than allowing it to remain a matter of rumour and half-truth in this village for another generation. The colonel was quiet a long moment, looking out over the churchyard wall toward the tower, its grey stones softened now by the pale morning light. "You have a gift, Miss Marple," he said at last, "for making an old man feel that his failures, however grave, are not the whole of what he is." "It is not a gift, Colonel," said Miss Marple with a small, private smile. "It is only that I have lived a very long time and watched a very great many people carry burdens they were never meant to carry alone, and I have come to believe, quite firmly, that very few of us are made up entirely of our worst moments, however large those moments may loom in our own private accounting. It is generally the whole of a life, weighed fairly, that tells us what a person truly is, not any single hour of it, however terrible." The trial itself, when it came, some months later at the county assizes, proceeded very much as such things do, a great deal of careful legal argument, a full accounting of the events Miss Marple had helped to uncover, and, in the end, a verdict of manslaughter rather than murder, the court accepting, on the strength of considerable evidence as to the circumstances and the absence of any real premeditation, that Rosalind Vane, for she gave her true name to the court, in what those who witnessed it agreed was a moment of considerable and rather moving dignity, had acted in a moment of overwhelming and provoked distress rather than in cold or calculated design. She was sentenced to a term of years, and the village, hearing the outcome relayed by those who had attended, found itself divided, as villages generally are on such matters, between those who thought the sentence too lenient and those who thought it, given all the circumstances, no more than a fair and rather merciful accounting of a genuinely tragic history. Ivy Nettleton, who had attended the trial herself, veiled and silent in the public gallery, told Miss Marple afterward that she had found herself, to her own considerable surprise, weeping not for Thomas alone, but for the woman in the dock as well, unable, in the end, to hate a person whose own history had been so entirely and so cruelly shaped by forces she had never chosen and could not have escaped. "I think that is very much to your credit, my dear," said Miss Marple, when Ivy told her this. "It is a rare and valuable thing to hold grief and compassion together in the same heart without either one crowding out the other. A great many people, faced with such a loss as yours, would have found it a good deal easier simply to hate, and I think you are the better for having resisted so easy a comfort." Chapter 17. What the village kept and what it let go. Harold Pruitt's shop, it was generally agreed by the autumn, had never done better trade, a fact he attributed, with a rueful honesty that had become rather more characteristic of him since the whole affair had come to light, to the plain curiosity of customers wishing to look upon a man who had once paid blackmail and lived to tell of it without any lasting harm to his standing. He had told his wife the whole of the small dishonesty himself, in the end, rather than waiting for it to emerge through the inspector's inquiries, and had found her a good deal more forgiving of a pinch short on the sugar than he had ever dared hope, once she understood the fear he had carried alone for the better part of a year. "I ought to have told her from the start," he confided to Miss Marple, one afternoon when she called in for her usual quarter-pound of tea. "I see that now. All that misery, carried alone, for nothing at all in the end, but a scolding I well deserved, and a promise, freely given, that she'd never think less of me for an honest confession than she would for a discovered lie. There's a lesson in that, Miss Marple, I shouldn't wonder, for anyone fool enough to think a secret kept is a secret safe." "There is indeed, Mr. Pruitt," said Miss Marple, though I have observed that it is a lesson every generation seems obliged to learn afresh for itself, however plainly it may be set out for them by those who have learned it before. I do not think there is any way to spare people the learning of it, except by living through some version of the fear themselves, and coming out the other side to find the truth was never quite so terrible as the years of dreading it. The Reverend Whitfield, for his part, preached a sermon some weeks after the trial's conclusion that the village would remember, and quote to one another for a good many years afterward, a sermon on the nature of secrets kept and secrets confessed, delivered with a plainness and a personal humility that owed a good deal, though he never said so directly from the pulpit, to his own recent and painful education in the subject. Mrs. Fanshawe, who considered herself something of a connoisseur of the vicar's preaching after 9 years of hearing it every Sunday, declared it the finest sermon he had ever given, and privately wondered to Sadie Blount whether a man needed to suffer something of the sort himself before he could properly speak to others about it, a piece of homely wisdom that Miss Marple, hearing it repeated to her over tea, thought rather truer than most theological observations she had encountered in a long life of attending church. Ivy Nettleton left Millbrook Fen that winter, taking a position in Faversham where, as she told Miss Marple in a letter written some months later, she had found it easier to build a fresh start away from a village that would forever, however kindly, associate her with a tragedy she wished at last to set behind her. She wrote warmly of Miss Marple's kindness during those difficult weeks, and enclosed a small pressed flower from her new garden, a gesture Miss Marple found unaccountably moving, and kept, afterward, pressed carefully into the very book of flowers she had once carried to the vicarage on the pretext of returning it. Colonel Ashby took, in the months that followed, to a quiet and rather touching correspondence with the parents of Corporal Alan Vane, who were by then elderly themselves and had spent 8 years believing their son had died in shame rather than through simple misfortune and another man's private grudge. It was, by all accounts, a difficult correspondence to begin and a healing one to continue, and the Colonel confided to Miss Marple, on one of their now regular morning conversations by the churchyard wall, that he had found in it a measure of the peace he had feared, for 8 long years, he might never be permitted to find. "It does not undo what was done," he said, "but it is, I think, something, perhaps all any of us can hope for in the end, when an old wrong can never be fully set right. Not the undoing of it, which is beyond any of our power, but the honest acknowledging of it, offered as plainly and completely as we are able to those who have carried its weight longest." "I think that is very wisely said, Colonel," Miss Marple replied, "and I think, moreover, it is very nearly the whole of what any of us can offer one another, in the face of the harm we cannot undo. An honest reckoning, given freely, is worth a very great deal more than we generally credit it, in a world so full of people determined to bury their mistakes rather than own them." Chapter 18. Evensong. It was on a mild evening some weeks later, with the last of the summer light lying long and golden across the churchyard grass, that Miss Marple came at last to the end of her fortnight's holiday, and prepared to take the afternoon train back to St. Mary Mead. Her small case packed, her needlework tidied away, and a quiet satisfaction settled upon her that had nothing whatever to do with pride in her own cleverness, and a great deal to do with a simpler, more private sense that some measure of order had been restored, however imperfectly, to a small corner of a troubled world. She walked, before the train, one last time past the church, where the bells of St. Aldhelm's were ringing for evensong under Digby's steady, unremarkable hand, a plain, competent peal, without the particular vanity Thomas Aldridge had brought to the ropes, but true and even and entirely without menace, calling the village to prayer across the water meadows exactly as it had done for generations before that terrible Sunday, and would, Miss Marple thought, go on doing for a good many generations yet, long after the events of this particular summer had faded into the sort of story told with steadily diminishing accuracy to visitors and newcomers who had not lived through it themselves. Delphine walked with her to the churchyard gate, and there they paused together to listen a moment to the bells, in the particular companionable silence of two people who have shared something difficult and come through it together. "Do you think she was truly wicked, Aunt Jane?" Delphine asked again, for the question had plainly continued to trouble her these past weeks, in the way that a first real brush with tragedy troubles the young in a manner it no longer quite manages with those who have lived long enough to have made their own uneasy peace with the world's capacity for sorrow. Mrs. Colfax, I mean. Rosalind Vane. "I have thought about that question a great deal, my dear," said Miss Marple, "and I do not believe I can answer it so simply as wicked or not wicked, though I understand the wish to have it settled one way or the other, for it would be a good deal more comfortable to know precisely where to place her in our own private accounting of good and bad people. I think rather that she was an ordinary woman, of real courage and real capability, who suffered a genuine and terrible wrong at the hands of forces entirely outside her own control, and who built, out of the wreckage of that wrong, a second life of real value and real respectability, and that when the past reached forward, quite by accident, to threaten that second life exactly as the first had once been threatened, something in her that had been strained to its very limit for 7 long years finally gave way beneath a weight no person, however strong, should reasonably be expected to bear entirely alone. I do not think that makes her wicked, precisely. I think it makes her human, in the saddest and most cautionary sense of that word, an ordinary person, tested past the point where ordinary goodness can any longer hold firm, and I think there is a lesson in that for all of us, if we are honest enough to receive it, rather than comforting ourselves with the easier thought that such things could never happen to people like ourselves. That seems a very sad way to end a story, Aunt Jane. Most true stories end rather sadly, my dear, if one looks at them closely enough, said Miss Marple, with the particular gentle firmness she reserved for observations she considered important. It is only in the storybooks that wickedness and goodness sort themselves out so neatly, with no untidy overlap between the two. Real life is a good deal messier than that, and a good deal more forgiving of the people caught up in its confusions, if we can only bring ourselves to look honestly at what actually happened, rather than reaching too quickly for the comfort of a simple verdict. I do not say this to excuse what Mrs. Colfax did. A young man is dead who had, whatever his own faults, a good many years of decent living still ahead of him, and that loss cannot be measured away by any amount of sympathy for the woman responsible for it. But I think we do the dead no honour, and the living no service, by pretending the world sorts itself as neatly into heroes and villains as we might privately wish it did. The bells rang on above them, steady and unhurried, calling the last stragglers of the village to their evening prayers, and Miss Marple stood a moment longer at the gate, listening, before she turned at last toward the station, her case in hand, carrying with her, as she always did from such visits, not the satisfaction of a puzzle solved so much as the quieter, more enduring understanding of human nature that had made the solving possible in the first place, an understanding that owed nothing to cleverness of the sort admired in detective novels, and a very great deal to the patient, unglamorous habit of watching people closely and listening to what they said and did not say, and never quite forgetting that behind every secret carefully kept lies a fear worth understanding before it is worth judging. The train, when it came, carried her away from Millbrook Fen in the last soft light of the evening, past hedgerows and water meadows, already settling into the blue stillness of dusk. And if she thought once more, as the church tower slipped from view behind a stand of elms, of a young man who had died reaching for a bell rope, and a woman who had killed him out of a grief that had never properly healed, she kept those thoughts, as she kept so much else, quietly and gently to herself, folded away with the same careful economy with which she folded her knitting, to be taken out again, perhaps, on some other quiet evening, and considered once more in the particular unhurried light of memory. The end.